let's jump in and have Ellie Fogle talk about at BB&T and a lot about how they look for culture and manage the culture. And in particularly, in Ellie's case, she's been in the industry for 28 years. She's a regional manager for the state of Maryland and has been a certified expert by BB&T's University, which is well recognized within the training world as being one of the top companies. Ellie, why don't we talk a little bit about this whole issue of how you interview for culture and what that means to you from a practical standpoint?
Sure. Thank you, Pat. I appreciate the opportunity. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Great.
And you know, Pat, I appreciate everything that you've covered here. It's just such a great fit. And you're right, corporate culture does matter. One of the greatest things we could do today is create a great culture, and nothing will mitigate a clash. So it's really, really important that we seek out those who fit. That's when people can be their best, when they know they fit in. So, yeah, when we hire, you're right, we tend to look at their sales tendencies, their sales personality, their sales knowledge, their sales motivation, and many times we forget the culture fit. We forget what it takes for them to be able to be their best at your company, and we forget to ask those questions. We forget to talk about what their state of mind is, what their story is, what their strategy is, and do they have a long-term vision. So it is those thought-provoking questions that will lead you down that path. And one of the first things that we need to do as leaders is to understand our corporate culture. If we can communicate and live our culture, we will be successful. If we can get our teams to communicate and live our culture, we'll be successful beyond our expectations. So it starts with knowing your company, knowing the culture, how that applies to your specific line of business, and communicating that in the interview process and asking those questions.
So, Ellie, in your practical experience, and of course, I've had a long-time relationship with BB&T, so I know how important culture is to them and that they incorporate it in the interview process. Do you find that because what happens is you're trying to sell that they should join your company, and then you're afraid to ask more difficult questions?
Well, I tell you, for working with a company that's lived a culture for over 140 years, I mean, I would tell you there are 35,000 plus employees. If we called any of them, they'd know the one thing that's non-negotiable is our vision, our mission, our values. So we know it in and out, and it becomes easy, and our decisions become easy. So we get to that point, but I'll tell you how we get there, and this might help those on the call. Of course, you're going to do your assessment, your sales assessment first. We start that with our recruiter. We go through a sales assessment, and that leads into these sales type questions. Then we have a separate model for leading into the culture. So yes, it is a little more difficult to make that transition because most salespeople do want to talk about themselves, their sales abilities, their production level, the things they're really good at, because they feel that's their zone and it's where they can perform and sell themselves. When you're able to communicate the company in which they're considering and want to be hired, you need to tell them a little bit about the company, there's no doubt. And that's really how you start it. I want to tell you a little bit about our organization. And what I do is I pull out our philosophy handbook. And I'll tell you, if you don't have one, you want to create one for your line of business. And you want it to align itself with your overall corporate culture. To create a material or something that you can present so that the candidate knows that's the way it's supposed to be. This is where the interview is going. And we talk about the vision, the mission, the core values, and how we work within them. And that leads into those thought-provoking questions. So a perfect example, one of our core values, a shared value, is integrity. And I'll ask the question, tell me about a time when your integrity was challenged. What did you do? And we go into what these are and we talk about it. And it does allow me to determine if there is a match.
So, Ellie, in your experience, by asking these types of questions, do you find that the candidates put off, why are you asking me this, or what do you end up seeing as how they react to those questions?
I generally don't have problems at all getting candidates to answer those questions. I mean, many are here for a reason. We've been around a while and have a very solid reputation. So many are expecting to have these types of questions. But no, I usually don't get pushback. we'll usually go over them because they are important, and they tend to give us their solid answers. Well, here was a time where I had a really tough decision to make, and I had to keep the client's best interest in mind. I couldn't use wishful thinking. I had to do what I had to do and communicate tough news. And those are the kinds of things that we're looking for. Anybody that's interviewed expects tough questions generally. You also want to see if they have a long-term vision for working for you. And you can ask those questions. What brought you here? I mean, that is a real good start. What brought you here? Why did you consider our company? And just them beginning to answer that will allow you to tell a little bit about the company and communicate the culture and then ask those questions.
So, Ellie, from your own practical experience of being in the trenches, would you say that you're interviewing quite a bit or what?
No, I'm not interviewing quite a bit. Not recently. I was about a year and a half ago to help form a team. Many of us have been in a situation where we had market changes that allowed us to have a lot of folks on hand just so we had the boots on the ground to handle the volume. And we may have formed teams that weren't a perfect culture match and weren't a time where we have to reassess them. I will get resumes, I will go out and recruit, and we'll put them through a sales process, and some make it to the culture interview and some don't.
Right, right. So talk a little bit about, the teams that have been built on numbers, which was the refinancing market, kind of what you just talked about. And how do you kind of reassess, those individuals? Do they fit to your current cultural fit?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question, and it's something that I've been working on for a year and a half, 2 years, and there's quite a few ways that we can determine whether our current teams fit the culture. Culture is definitely a relevant topic. It is something that we're going to need to adopt, especially in today's regulatory environment. We want to know we have the right people doing the right thing. One of the tools I use, Pat, is something that you sent out in a blog, my gosh, maybe 2 years ago, and it's where you break your producers into 4 categories. And I wish I had your material that I put on the web page for you, but I'm sure you can get that for the team that's on the call. But who are your star producers? That's one category. Who are your capable but not motivated? Who are your motivated but not capable? And who are the problems? And then beside each of the members on the team that are in those 4 categories, there's 2 questions. Are they currently a culture match? And the second question is, do I have a long-term vision for them being a player on the team? So the first thing you could do is create a good culture. And if one's not already there for you, you've got to develop it. And you've got to decide who are those star producers in that number 1 category that have a yes next to culture match and a yes next to long-term vision as a player on the team. You have got to be able to communicate that vision to those star players, and they've got to help you get upward. They will either help you lift the team or pull the weeds, one or the other. So you've got to be able to communicate a compelling vision for where you're going and get those star producers on board with you. That's one tool that we use. A second tool, and that's a tool that I just simply took on in my region and chose to use, and I love that tool, Pat. It was a wonderful lesson.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the second thing that I use is a team assessment development tool, which is something I came up with. So the first of every year, the team has to create a business plan where they think their production will be. We have a one-on-one coaching session I do with each of the team members, and I ask them to assess themselves. Because we know as sales leaders, what do our MLOs believe right now? We know that how they view themselves has a lot to do with whether they will sell and be successful. Most people can't be successful beyond their own views, and their success will rarely exceed their own personal development. So I ask a lot of personal development questions. I'll ask them, what do you think your key selling skills are? Tell me about your work discipline. What are your greatest strengths? What are your greatest areas to improve? And we go through a personal assessment and determine, are these people that should be on the team or shouldn't? Then we recognize weaknesses or any areas that don't fit. They may not fit the culture match, and we talk about, is that a behavioral problem? What do they believe? What is their mindset right now? And can they believe? There are a couple of tools that we use to get them up to speed.
So how do you, Ellie, from the practical standpoint, how do you handle this whole communication? I mean, every company in the world has mission statements. Every company in the world, has something that they use as their tagline. But how do you keep communicating what it is? I mean, I'm certainly familiar with BB&T because the pre-hire assessment's been used there for many years. But the truth of the matter is, BB&T had a vision for a very long time. Of the 150 years you're talking about, is that the contributions of the individual and the development of the individual is very important. But how do you keep communicating? People, when they hear mission statements, they tend to blank out. How do you make it realized is what I'm trying to ask.
Sure. So you could do this with new hires, or you can do it with assessing your current team. One of the things that I go back to is the annual performance development plan, where we will rate the associates on both their sales performance, which is numbers driven, and also their organizational values and core competencies. And we just go right down the line and say, what do you think this means? And this is where I'd rate you on a meet, the below, and exceed. And this is what we need to do moving forward. The other thing is everything that we do as a sales team is centered around behaviors, because we know that behaviors drive results, and their behaviors will only be developed out of what they believe. So do they have the buy-in? If they don't, there's got to be communications on, here are the non-negotiable things that are core basics that's expected of a mortgage loan officer in this organization. So non-negotiable items include attending every Monday sales call, and that's my opportunity to communicate to the culture every Monday, and attend every MLO meeting once a month. And you must participate and be engaged and show up on time. So they know that they're getting graded based on those things. And we set the standards. Here's what we cover in those meetings. Here's what's expected of you. So almost every MLO has 10 non-negotiable items on their Outlook calendar, and they know that's what's expected.
So, Ellie, when you look at that, I mean, how are top producers treated differently, or in other words, and I guess if they're not treated differently, when people disengage, are you having a cultural conversation pretty quick?
Well, top producers aren't treated differently. As a matter of fact, in most of our cases, and probably most of the folks on the call will vouch for this, our top producers probably get less attention because we're spending time on more of the problem or the lower performers. And we know in times like this that great MLOs get better, and when the market shifts, and mediocre just get worse. So we tend to spend our time in the wrong areas. So what we do need to do is we need to understand what it takes to be a top performer, and we need to recognize that with these top performers. So you spend just as much coaching time with your top performers as you do your low, and we know that outstanding achievers absolutely and completely believe in the mission. And we communicate, do you know our mission? Do you know what that means? What do you, and how do you use it every day? We know they're committed time, energy, and resources to make it happen. We know that they train themselves and invest in themselves to have the best skills possible, and that they enjoy the journey, and they're in their zone, and they're lifting everyone else. So we engage that. We ask them on the sales calls, can you do this piece, or can you take over and cover this topic? At an MLO meeting, can you show some of your strategies and skills and your boots on the ground type systems that you use? And when our team sees these top producers sharing and showing teamwork and mutual supportiveness, it tends to raise the tide for everybody.
Right. Right. Well, what about those that, let's say you had a long-term employee, and let's say, obviously the business has changed completely, in the last, 6 to 12 months, and let's say it doesn't look like they're buying into the mission anymore. What's the sequence for that?
Well, what I do is we'll go through the team assessment. Now, we do have a formalized process that any manager can engage in when they feel it's necessary. It's called a performance improvement plan. So if an MLO is below standards on production or behaviors for a certain average period of time, we could do a 3-month or a 6-month, it's time to engage. It's time to go over what's expected. And we need to say, you know what, where's your mind right now? Where's your mindset? What is the story that you're married to? What is the story you're telling out there? What do you feel is our value proposition? What's our mission? You know, what do you believe in here? Because we know those beliefs will drive the behaviors. And if the belief isn't there, we give them a certain amount of time to see if they can change their behaviors or perform, or there is a process where they're coached out.
Right. So from your viewpoint, you know, let's say you're having, you know, the individual that might have been good in the past, but just is having a difficult time handling the new demands. What happens with those?
Well, what we do is, again, we'll go over strengths and weaknesses. We truly believe in integrated relationships. So we do believe in a team atmosphere, working with others in the company. We'll go through teaming them up with a top producing officer, where they can see the behaviors, they can see the systems and the strategies. So we'll self-assess. We'll say, where do you think you're weak? You know, where are you spending your time in a day? What do you think are the core behaviors that will get you the results that you need now that the market has changed? How comfortable are you doing these type activities? Where do you think you need help? And we'll generally team them up with someone that may be stronger in the areas in which they're weak to help get them comfortable.
Well, that's great. Mm-hmm. Go on.
Yeah, they'll generally shadow someone. So we might have someone that has a very difficult time communicating difficult situations with loans, so therefore they never give statuses or never follow up, or, I mean, we've all had them, but they just have a real tough time communicating tough news. So we'll team them up with an expert that's just really, really good at keeping the clients informed and the agents informed and the builders informed, and they'll just shadow them for a while.
Ellie, do you see the top producers not wanting to be shadowed?
No, you know, I don't, and the reason I don't is because they already buy into the corporate mission, vision, and values, and one of those is teamwork and mutual supportiveness, and they're incented on that, and they're graded on that. So usually I have absolutely no problems getting volunteers when I say, hey, can you help this person on the team a little bit? They're struggling in this one area. Generally, they're willing to help, and they get exceptional reviews for that.
So they're not being paid, like, for instance, some companies will do it like, well, okay, you can shadow, but you're going to now get an override. So you're not really doing that.
No, we do have a junior MLO, senior MLO, incentive-type formalized program. I'm not currently using it in my region, but the mentoring is a voluntary-type process.
And they usually look at that as something that they're glad to do, is what I hear you saying.
They do, and that's one of the things that they're graded on their annual assessment is their teamwork and mutual supportiveness, so that falls into that area, any coaching and mentoring.
Okay. That's great. It's a great point. Is there any questions through the chat feature that we have for Ellie that we want to ask today? Why don't you take a minute here to pick Ellie's brain? Ellie, we have a question from Sue out there, and she was asking about, you know, how many, when you're interviewing for culture, again, going back to last year, how many people are you having to go through before you actually find a match? Or did the candidate know that, you know, before they join, you know, what BB&T, let's say, is about?
Well, we do have a multi-step process, and that's actually a very good question. We don't interview exclusively to culture. Culture is critically important. It is paramount. But our interviewing process, it begins much like yours would, or our recruiting process begins much like yours would. So we would have a recruit, we'd see a candidate come across, their resume will come across, we review it for experience and history, or maybe it's someone that I have my eye on because they've been a good solid producer and have a real good reputation in the community or one of the markets that we serve. Once we know their sales tendencies and whether it appears there's someone that would be a good match for production, because productivity is one of our values. We've got to be extremely productive, and we have very tough goals. Once we know that's a match is when we'll set up the face-to-face interview with me. So they get past the recruiter at that point in that initial interview, and that's when we talk about, you know, the industry itself, you know, how they're doing productivity-wise, that kind of thing, and then we get into the culture itself. So I don't interview just for culture, but we do go through that phase. I will tell you, there have been, I would say, 1 in 10, to answer your question. I don't have, all the results right here in front of me, but I'd say 1 in 10, I feel like, matches all the areas. The culture, I feel like they portray the company well on the street, and they would do what's in the best interest of the client, and that they would also have the sales productivity there. So it's about 1 in 10.
Okay. Even in this, although you're not recruiting, but even in this market, would you say this where everybody seems to be chasing after people?
I would tell you one of the toughest things right now is my own team being solicited to be recruited. So yeah, it is definitely different. It's easier for me to hire right now because the decisions become very clear whether someone's going to be a long-term fit or not versus when things are going great. So what you believe things are going great when there's a good market out there. So a lot of us believe just because we're doing the production, things are moving along, we're making money, everything looks good, we're handling all these transactions, that we're just a great salesperson. That's not necessarily the case. So when the market shifts, are we really that good? Are we doing that? Are we able to shift? Are we able to adapt? Can we adjust? Can we still be the heavy hitter? So it's real easy. That's why we interview and we hire to behaviors instead of W-2s or transactions. So my interview questions may be, tell me the systems and strategies and behaviors that you'll put in place to get this amount of business that you project you will get over the next year. Tell me how you would, tell me how you would tell our company.
Yeah, just a side note, and we know this from the research, that when, originator A is at company A and he moves to company B, he's going to lose, or she's going to lose 50% of her pipeline. So she or him has to have the right behaviors to rebuild that pipeline. And I think what I see many times companies doing is just looking at, the pipeline, and when they think they're getting a $12 million or $15 million originator, they're really getting 7.5 because his clients will not move. And as a result, you better get the behavior part down. Does that person have the ability to rebuild the pipeline? Is that your experience also?
That is exactly right. You never know. You've really got to know the company in which the candidate came from in order to determine where they're going, because if they came from a company that owned the market and they were more reactive, they were order takers filling out 165 boxes on a 1003 and handing it in, and that's not what the market is dictating today. You've got to know that. So you do definitely ask the questions to behavior and to strategy. And if someone who wants a job cannot show me their strategy and their behaviors and how to obtain the business they need, then I'll never get those strategies and behaviors out of them once they get the job.
Yeah, great point, great point. Ellie, you've been fantastic today. I certainly appreciate you spending the time and sharing your expertise. And certainly, Ellie would love to connect with you on LinkedIn, so certainly go to LinkedIn and look for that. And certainly, I'm sure she would be glad to answer any of your questions that you might have after the webinar. I also want to just mention a couple things that Ellie did mention my sales blog, and I never even asked her. So by going to my website, you can sign up for the sales blog, my weekly sales blog, and we cover managerial questions all over the board, and love to have you join us with that. And also any other questions that you might have about the behavioral questions or the cultural assessment, glad to answer that.